From its earliest origins, people's relationship with nature and the environment has been a core theme in art. In earlier examples of art, artists portrayed the natural world as a mystic, powerful entity, a kind of physically dominating force. Hokusai's grandiose great wave, Frederick Edwin Church's untamable icebergs, Toyn's ferocious birds, or Peter Graham's wandering shadows. But in recent decades, that dynamic has turned on its head, as humankind's impact on our environment becomes ever more clear, urgent, and irreversible.
It's a matter of the safety of the human race, so I think, of course, artists are going to be interested in that.
There is a deep connection to climate catastrophe that is rooted in race and privilege.
It can often feel like, those dream nightmares when you are screaming but nothing comes out.
What is the role of artists in tackling our urgent climate crisis? And what are the different approaches they've taken to raise awareness and engage us with our increasingly fragile natural world? OK, so let's begin by going back to when humankind started having a dramatic effect on our environment. As industrialisation in the UK rapidly developed in the late 18th century, artworks document the changes in our cities.
We've gone from the medieval and Renaissance representations of landscape and nature, which are very much about sort of seeing God in the landscape, to where we are now, a post-industrial landscape.
Smoke rises, ships swarm the docks, and the landscape evolves. L.S. Lowry's work captures these changes with, as he describes it, a range of tones akin to an apocalypse of grime.
Lamenting the loss of nature, a different attitude towards consumption, and a dehumanisation of the workforce as well.
Very efficient farms where people have been cleared off the land and it now looks very beautiful and peaceful, but actually there's a disturbance there. There's a sort of underlying violence almost that the artists are sometimes directly expressing through their work.
In the collection we have some photographs by Peter Cattrall which are of damage that's been wrought on the landscape by conflict. He has these images of the land that's been reclaimed for farming, but the photographs that we see are of the crops after they've been harvested, so it's these cut off stalks, which is so reminiscent of these graves that extend as far as the eye can see.
Of course, we're now far more accustomed to industrialisation, factories, pollution and emissions. For contemporary artists, the challenge is difficult. How do you reflect or visualise a seemingly imperceptibly slow process of change when we're so used to the causes of it? In this photographic triptych, Patricia MacDonald subtly explores the threat posed by the melting of the world's ice caps and glaciers, prompting us to think of the land that will be drowned by rising seas. How do we feel when we see a chunk of ice changing state into a trickle and then a flood of meltwater? Ilana Halperin's work explores geology as a way to understand our relationship to our planet. She creates space to reflect on our place within a constantly evolving and changing world. From prints that use ink made from a core sample from Scottish geologist James Hutton's farm, to watercolours that explore the fascinating geology on the Isle of Bute. Halperin encourages us to look closely at the world around us, to notice the ground beneath our feet and the seasonal changes.
If you can find something that touches people and that they kind of engage in that kind of more emotional level.
Katie Patterson's Future Library project saw a selection of authors including Margaret Atwood, Han Kang and David Mitchell write original works only for them to be locked away until 2114.
It is housed in Norway. And the books are printed on paper that is made from trees from the forest outside Oslo.
It's a hopeful, optimistic piece about harmony between humans and nature. In the words of contributing author Karl Uwe Kanauska, the future doesn't exist, it's what we make it. Increasingly though, for many, quiet reflection is no longer enough. Other artists have explored climate change with a more visceral, head-on approach.
It's human nature. You know it yourself. If you're speaking to someone and you try to begin with, you try to be calm and reasonable and explain your point of view. When you come across people who don't have that point of view, I think then you do have to push things. You do have to take things further. You do have to provoke that response.
There is clearly something that makes some people very uncomfortable about bigger parts of the patrimony being maybe challenged.
How about dropping 24 enormous blocks of ice from Greenland, bang, in the middle of central London? The 2014 project, Ice Watch, created by Olaf Eliasson and Minnick Rossing. aims to, as they put it, emotionalise the data, make it physically tangible through the subtle cracks of pressure as bubbles thousands of years old release across the city, showing hordes of passers-by the physical realities of global warming. In contrast to earlier representations of nature as a mighty power, many artists now highlight our world as fragile, decaying and dying. Jenny Holzer is similarly direct.
She's most well known for her text-based works, which are often found in public places.
Projecting the words of over 40 climate activists, from Sir David Attenborough to Greta Thunberg, onto landmark buildings across the UK, Holzer brings these stark warnings and calls to action into the public space. It's through art that we can really viscerally see this change as it happens. Since the 1970s, Klaus Stack used similarly plain, blunt phrases. This piece translates to "freedom dies in centimetres," showing a book in an ever-raising ocean, and another "new life blossoms out of the ruins as a tree grows from a network of freeways." But opinions differ on whether these visceral shock tactics work long-term.
So yes, like shock can have an effect on parts of the population that need that wake-up call. But at the same time, where does that lead and how sustainable is it? What kind of activism does it actually produce?
Of course, when we or artists speculate about the future of the Earth's climate, we're missing something key. It has already been happening for a long time, affecting millions of lives across the globe.
There is this idea that this is what things could be in the future. You're already adopting the perspective of someone who this hasn't happened to, someone who has the luxury of looking into the future rather than fighting for their life today.
The climate issue is also intrinsically a huge societal issue through historical and present-day injustices, centuries of colonialism and racism. People of colour in the global south are and will continue to be disproportionately affected by climate change, despite having amongst the lowest carbon footprints.
Colonialism and racism are at the root of the climate crisis. Like, there would be no climate crisis the way we know it if it wasn't for racism and colonialism.
The two things are not separate. They're both the same issue. People are leaving parts of the world.
Those who are most affected by the climate crisis are also the ones not being heard. The emissions come from the rich, essentially. Half of the world's emissions by lifestyle are created by 10% of the world's population. That's insane.
In the Pacific, they think of the water as being a highway and less of a back door. So the water is always present when they're thinking about the world and how they move through it and how they need to take care of that water. There are many layers to the images that are presented in the tapestry. The motif of the snake is very present, and the hands, which are the whitest part, the most gleaming, and in some ways possibly most seductive part of the tapestry, are made from whaling ropes and being used as a source of commerce.
Ade Adesina combines traditional printmaking techniques to explore the effects of climate change, deforestation and energy consumption. It's really striking artwork that combines objects, places and scenes from his African heritage, British culture and his travels around the world. You can often see the backdrop of Aberdeen, the city he now lives in, and the North Sea oil and fishing industries in his work. Right now in our current society, obviously, there's a limit to what art can realistically do.
Can art feed into that? Yes, definitely. It can be part of a discourse, it can be part of a dialogue, but some of these issues are so big, they have to be addressed at a kind of global or governmental level.
If you're truly wanting your art to matter, and I mean that in a way that it will lead to change, lead to action, then maybe you have to step outside of the art world, actually. Rather than art being seen as activism, art working with activism.
So in essence, what we should be doing is opening up and not talking to ourselves, but talking to the world more broadly.
We often ask, is it now too late for real change?
It's not a new problem. And when you're saying that it's too late, then the question is like, for who? Right? Is it too late for you to continue having your lifestyle that you're used to? Perhaps. Is it too late to save millions of people? Definitely not.
In the words of Scottish poet Jackie Kay, I was particularly concerned about the future of the natural world, and it's shocking that nearly 50 years on, that concern remains the same.
You need to be honest about what kind of change is needed. It's not just about putting out a fire, it's about changing everything.